What if the most powerful military on Earth is quietly running out of the one thing it needs most to keep fighting? 2 days ago, the president stood in front of cameras and canceled a bombing campaign that was already loaded, already fueled, and already sitting on the runway. He said Iran wanted peace. He said a deal was close, but somewhere inside the Pentagon, a different reason was sitting quietly on a classified report. And it had nothing to do with peace. Before we go further, do one thing for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, not because I asked nicely, but because this channel is about to become the place where you understand this war before the news anchors do. Tap like if you want more of this kind of breakdown. Share it with one person who still thinks this conflict is simple. Now, let's get into it. For months, the story you've been told about this war is a story of American power. Big jets, big carriers, big threats. And on the surface, that story looks true. The United States has more warships, more aircraft, and more firepower than any nation that has ever existed in human history. So when Iran fired missiles at American bases, almost everyone assumed the outcome was obvious. America would absorb the hits, strike back harder, and eventually Iran would fold under the pressure. But something strange kept happening. Every time it looked like the moment for a knockout blow had arrived, America pulled back. Instead, strikes got announced, then quietly canceled. Deadlines got set, then pushed further down the calendar. Threats got made, then softened into talk of negotiations. If America truly held all the power in this fight, why does it keep hesitating at the exact moment it should be closing the door? The answer is not weakness of will. It's something more physical, more measurable, and honestly more frightening than politics. It's math. Cold, hard, unforgiving math about what it costs to shoot down a missile compared to what it costs to fire one in the first place. Here's the picture nobody wants to draw for you in plain terms. Every time Iran launches a missile toward a U.S. base or a U.S. ally, America has to respond with an interceptor, not a rifle, not a soldier standing in a trench, a multi-million-dollar piece of precision technology built to chase down and destroy a single incoming threat before it lands. The missile Iran fires might cost a fraction of that price. The interceptor America fires back costs millions every single time, whether it succeeds or misses. Now, stretch that math out over 5 straight months of fighting, over hundreds of launches, over dozens of near misses and successful intercepts, night after night, base after base. You start to see why a war that looks on television like a demonstration of overwhelming strength is actually quietly draining a resource that cannot be refilled overnight, no matter how much money gets thrown at the problem. According to a detailed assessment published in late July by a respected Washington Research Institute, the United States has burned through roughly 2/3 of its entire Patriot interceptor stockpile since this war began. 2/3 gone in under half a year. The number of Patriot interceptors sitting in American storage has dropped from well over 2,000 down to somewhere between 700 and 800 remaining. And Patriot isn't even the top-tier system in this fight. The real crown jewel of American missile defense is called THAAD, built specifically to shoot down the most dangerous long-range ballistic threats before they can even begin their final descent. That stockpile has fallen too, dropping nearly 40%, from several hundred interceptors down to roughly half of that original number. Sit with that for a second. This is not a hypothetical scenario dreamed up for dramatic effect. This is not fear-mongering designed to keep you watching. These are numbers close enough to internal government estimates that multiple sources with direct access to Pentagon data confirmed them to a major news outlet on the record. The people actually running this war know exactly how thin the shield protecting American forces has become. And a shield that thin cannot keep absorbing hits forever without something eventually breaking. The researchers who wrote that report ended their findings with a single sentence that deserves to be repeated slowly, out loud so it sinks in properly. They said that shrinking stockpiles may force the United States to take greater risks with its interceptions going forward. Translate that out of careful diplomatic government language, and it means something much simpler and much scarier than it sounds on paper. America may soon have to start choosing which incoming threats get intercepted, and which ones simply get allowed through. Now here's the part that should really worry you, more than any single missile or any single headline. Replacing these weapons isn't fast, it isn't cheap, and it definitely isn't simple, no matter how much political pressure gets applied. The company that builds the Patriot Interceptor currently produces around 180 of them a year. 180 against a stockpile that just lost well over 1,000 units in a matter of months. From the moment a new contract is officially signed to the moment a fresh interceptor rolls off the production line and actually reaches a launcher out in the field, the timeline stretches out 3 to 5 years. Years, not weeks. Years, while the war keeps burning through the old supply in real time. Compare that to how previous generations of American leaders handled a sudden wartime shortage. In past major conflicts, entire industries got converted almost overnight. Factories turning into aircraft plants within months, whole cities reorganizing their economy around a single wartime goal. That kind of rapid industrial mobilization simply doesn't exist anymore in the same way. Modern precision weapons depend on specialized microchips, rare components, and supply chains stretched across multiple countries, none of which can be conjured into existence through sheer national willpower alone. Wanting more interceptors faster does not make them appear faster. That gap between old wartime instincts and new industrial reality is exactly the trap America finds itself sitting inside right now. The Army recently signed a massive new contract worth well over $150 billion, just to keep interceptor production running all the way through the early 2030s. Think about that number sitting next to the actual speed of the war happening right now, today, this week. The missiles arriving in American hands right now were paid for and ordered years ago, back when nobody imagined this level of sustained, grinding conflict. The Pentagon is now asking Congress for a huge jump in emergency funding, nearly triple what it normally spends on munitions in a given year, just to try to catch up to where the fighting already is. There are plans, of course, to scale up the factories, to build faster, to eventually hit production numbers as high as 400 interceptors a year. But plans on paper are not missiles sitting ready in a launcher. That expanded capacity doesn't exist today. It might exist in a few years, if everything goes according to schedule. And a war happening right now doesn't wait politely for a factory upgrade to finish construction. So now you understand the first half of what I like to call the asymmetric ratchet. A ratchet, if you've never held one in your hands, is a mechanical tool that only turns in one direction. You crank it forward and it locks into place. It physically cannot slip backward on its own. That's exactly what's happening here on the military side of this war. Every attack forces a response. Every response burns through resources that take years to rebuild. And once those resources are spent, there is no quiet way back to where things started. The ratchet only clicks forward toward more spending, more risk, and less room to maneuver. But military math is only half of this story, and honestly, it might not even be the more dangerous half. If you want to understand why the president canceled strikes and then, within hours, started talking publicly about negotiations, you also need to understand the political ratchet grinding away underneath all of it. And the second ratchet is arguably more volatile, because it's driven by something far less predictable than a factory production schedule. It's driven by public opinion, and public opinion can turn fast. Right before those strikes were canceled, a series of polls quietly came out that barely made headlines, but honestly should have led every broadcast that night. Fewer than 4 in 10 Americans supported launching new strikes on Iran. Roughly half of the country said they didn't believe this war had been worth its cost so far. Nearly 8 in 10 expected the fighting to keep dragging on for a long time, with no real end date in sight. 2 out of every 3 Americans said they were personally feeling the financial pain of this war through rising gas prices, hovering close to $4 a gallon, sharply up from where prices sat before the fighting first began. And in a separate survey, close to 6 in 10 Americans admitted they didn't even understand what the president's actual goal in Iran was anymore, months into the conflict. Read those numbers again slowly and picture what it actually feels like to be the person making the final decision. A leader who orders a massive new bombing campaign right now isn't stepping into a united, supportive country cheering him on. He's stepping into a tired, confused, financially squeezed public that is rapidly losing patience with the whole situation. And with elections just months away on the calendar, that kind of political weather changes absolutely everything about how a leader calculates risk before making a single move. There's a concept from political science that explains this dynamic perfectly, and once you understand it, you'll start seeing it everywhere in how leaders behave during a crisis. When a leader makes a big public threat and then backs away from it without actually following through, voters tend to punish that leader for looking weak in front of the world. It's sometimes called the cost of appearing to back down. So leaders get trapped in a corner of their own making. They can't easily de-escalate without looking defeated. But they also can't easily escalate without paying a massive political and economic price back home at the exact moment their approval numbers are already shaky. Every single decision from this point forward has to be filtered through one brutal, unavoidable question. Does this help win the war, or does this help win the next election? And here's what makes this genuinely unsettling to think about. Iran understands this dynamic, not vaguely, not by accident, but with real precision built from decades of watching American politics up close. They know that restraint gets read as weakness by voters back home. They know aggression gets read as reckless by that same tired public. They know exactly how thin the tightrope is that any American president has to walk in the months before a major election. And knowing your opponent's political calendar better than your opponent understands it themselves is its own kind of weapon. Quiet and invisible, but every bit as real as a missile. Right now, in this conflict, Iran appears to be holding that weapon with both hands. Think about what that pressure actually feels like for the families living through it, not just the analysts writing reports about it from a distance, families near American bases. Overseas checking the news every morning before checking anything else. Parents back home watching gas prices climb while trying to explain to their kids why groceries keep costing more each week. Service members extending deployments they were told would be short, missing birthdays and graduations, because the mission keeps stretching further than anyone promised. None of these numbers we've walked through are abstract. Every single one of them lands on a real person somewhere, and that's exactly why. Understanding the true shape of this war matters, far beyond simple curiosity about geopolitics. If you're starting to feel like this war is more complicated and more fragile than the headlines have been letting on, you're exactly right. And that's precisely why we need to keep going together. Stay with me, because the next part of this story involves a single missile that changed the entire risk equation for every pilot flying over that region. And almost no one outside defense circles is talking about it the right way. Before we go there, let's pause for just a second. If this video is opening your eyes to something you hadn't fully considered before, do me a favor. Drop a comment telling me one single number from this breakdown that genuinely surprised you the most. I read every single comment, and honestly, your answers shape exactly what I dig into for the next video in this series. Let's talk about the aircraft, because this single incident quietly rewired how this entire war is being fought from the air. In early April, an American fighter jet, one of the most capable strike aircraft in the entire U.S. arsenal, was shot down over southwestern Iran, deep inside rugged mountain terrain that offers almost nowhere to hide. Both crew members ejected safely. The pilot was rescued within a matter of hours. The other crew member spent nearly 2 full days evading capture in hostile territory before finally being pulled to safety in a tense, high-stakes operation that could have ended very differently. At first, officials suggested the jet had been hit by a simple shoulder-fired missile, the kind of weapon that's relatively common around the world and doesn't require much technical sophistication to operate. But weeks later, a very different picture quietly emerged from official sources. Multiple U.S. officials with direct knowledge of the incident told reporters that the weapon was likely a far more advanced portable air defense system, and that it was almost certainly Chinese-made. The same sources indicated that Iran may have also received a sophisticated long-range radar system from China, one specifically capable of detecting aircraft that are designed and built to be nearly invisible to normal radar coverage. Think about the size difference here for just a moment, because it really does matter. The missile that brought down that jet weighs somewhere around 40 pounds. It can be carried on the back of a single soldier hiding in mountain terrain, waiting patiently for the right moment. The aircraft it destroyed cost close to $90 million to build, train, cruise for, and keep flying. A 40-pound weapon fired from a hidden position tucked into the mountains took down one of the most advanced strike jets in the entire world in a matter of seconds. When reporters eventually asked China's embassy in Washington directly about this incident, the response wasn't a flat denial. It was a carefully worded, measured statement about China always acting responsibly regarding its military exports around the world. That kind of answer isn't an accident, and it isn't sloppy phrasing either. That's the kind of sentence a government prepares well, in advance, when they already know a hard question is eventually coming, and they've made a calculated decision not to lie outright, but also not to admit anything directly on the record. Here's why this single incident matters so much more than it first appears on the surface. The same Washington research report mentioned earlier also noted that the United States is running low on what are called standoff weapons, the long-range missiles that let American aircraft strike targets from far outside enemy air defenses, without ever needing to enter the actual danger zone below. If those particular stockpiles keep shrinking at the current pace, American pilots may increasingly be forced to fly closer to the ground, closer to mountain ridgelines, closer to exactly the kind of terrain where a hidden Chinese-made missile system can sit and wait undetected for hours at a time. This is the exact moment the entire cost calculation of this war quietly shifted underneath everyone's feet. Not because Iran suddenly built a stronger military entirely on its own initiative. Iran didn't invent this particular technology. It didn't manufacture that advanced radar system from scratch in some domestic factory. Someone else supplied both pieces of equipment quietly, without ever needing to send a single soldier of their own or fire a single shot themselves in this entire conflict. That's not the behavior of a country simply selling a few spare parts on the open market. That's the behavior of a country deliberately reshaping how dangerous this war is for one side, from a safe and comfortable distance, while paying almost none of the actual price for doing so. And that brings us to the piece of this story that almost never gets mentioned in the endless cable news debates about troop movements and carefully worded diplomatic statements. Follow the oil, and you'll find the real winner of this entire war, sitting quietly, far away from any actual battlefield, collecting the benefits while everyone else pays the cost. Despite the sanctions, Despite repeated warnings from the U.S. Treasury Department, despite constant public statements about not letting Iran hold global trade hostage, Iranian oil never actually stopped flowing out of the country. It simply stopped flowing through the normal, visible, trackable channels. Instead, it now moves through what analysts have started calling a shadow fleet, a loose collection of roughly 400 aging tankers operating largely outside any official international tracking system. During one recent stretch alone, Iran is estimated to have exported somewhere around $6 billion worth of crude oil to China through this hidden, informal network, almost entirely outside the reach of Western sanctions enforcement. Here's how it actually works, step by step, because once you see the mechanics laid out clearly, you start to understand why sanctions haven't managed to stop it. Tankers load crude oil at an Iranian export terminal on the coast. They sail under the watchful protection of Iran's own naval forces, straight through the Strait of Hormuz, without much resistance. Once they're far enough out into open water, somewhere east of Malaysia, they simply switch off their tracking transponders and disappear from public monitoring systems. And into the darkness of untracked international waters, they carry out a ship-to-ship transfer, moving the oil onto a completely different vessel. That oil gets relabeled along the way, often listed on paperwork as originating from a totally different country altogether. Then it sails onward, quietly, to independent refineries concentrated heavily in eastern China. And critically, the payments for all of this never touch the US dollar system at any point, which means American sanctions can't easily choke off the money the way they're designed to. Instead, the money moves through China's own cross-border payment network, a financial system that processed an almost unimaginable amount of currency last year alone, up sharply from the year before that. The discounted Iranian oil sells for roughly $8 to $12 less per barrel than standard global pricing. The discount doesn't scare cautious buyers away from the deal. It actively attracts them instead. It creates a built-in financial incentive to keep buying sanctioned Iranian oil specifically because it happens to be sanctioned and therefore cheaper than the alternative. Now ask yourself the only question that actually matters in all of this. Who benefits the most from two powerful nations grinding each other down slowly in a long, expensive, exhausting war? Not America, which is burning through irreplaceable interceptors at a rate it clearly cannot sustain for much longer. Not Iran, which remains under constant military pressure and severe economic strain from every direction. The answer, when you follow the money and the missiles all the way to the end, is China, quietly buying discounted oil by the tanker load, quietly processing the payments through its own closed financial system, quietly, according to multiple credible reports, supplying at least some of the very weapons that are shifting the danger calculus for American pilots flying overhead, not risking a single soldier of its own in this fight, not firing a single shot from its own military, simply watching two rivals wear each other down over months and years, while positioning itself as the indispensable buyer, the indispensable financier, and quite possibly the indispensable arms supplier, all at the very same time. That's not the behavior of a bystander casually watching from the sidelines with mild curiosity. That's the behavior of an architect, quietly and patiently building the entire table that everyone else is now forced to sit at, whether they realize it or not. And the uncomfortable truth is that this pattern isn't limited to oil alone. The same shadow logistics, the same workarounds, the same quiet financial routes built to dodge sanctions, tend to get reused and refined once they exist. A network built to move oil in secret can just as easily move other things in secret later. Technology, components, even influence. Once that kind of infrastructure is built and tested successfully under pressure, it doesn't simply disappear when this particular war ends. It becomes a permanent tool, ready and waiting for the next crisis, wherever it happens to unfold next. Now, before I hand you my predictions, I owe you something important. I owe you the strongest possible version of the other side of this argument, because a channel that only shows you one angle isn't analysis. It's just another opinion dressed up as fact. So let's steelman the case for American strength, as honestly and as fully as I can make it. The argument goes like this. America still possesses the largest, most technologically advanced military the world has ever seen. Even with a dented interceptor stockpile, that arsenal dwarfs anything Iran can field on its own. Factories can be expanded. Emergency contracts can be signed. If Washington truly wanted to end this quickly, it could widen its target list far beyond military sites, hitting power grids, ports, and other infrastructure that would make the war unbearably costly for ordinary Iranians almost overnight. Saudi Arabia has already joined the coalition in some capacity, adding regional weight to the pressure campaign. Israel continues to act as a force multiplier, sharing intelligence and striking targets that stretch Iranian air defenses even thinner than they already are. Iran's economy is under real, serious strain from every direction at once. Under this view, all America truly needs is patience, and time will do the rest of the work on its own. I want you to actually feel the weight of that argument for a second, because it isn't nothing. There are serious, experienced people in Washington who genuinely believe this version of events. And honestly, it probably explains the first few months of this war fairly well. It does not explain where we are sitting right now, 5 months in, watching a president cancel his own strikes less than 2 days after promising them. Here's the piece the Steelman conveniently leaves out. Naval strain. The U.S. Navy has kept multiple carrier strike groups rotating through the region for months now, and each rotation puts enormous wear on ships, crews, and support systems that were never designed to sustain this kind of continuous high-tempo deployment. Sailors are hitting the edge of their deployment limits. Maintenance schedules are getting pushed back. Every extra week, a carrier group stays in theater is a week it isn't home, refitting, training the next generation of crews, or covering some other part of the world where American interests also need protecting. Strength that gets stretched across too many fronts for too long eventually stops looking like strength and starts looking like exhaustion wearing a uniform. And history has a quiet way of repeating this exact pattern. Again and again, across different decades and different wars, powerful nations rarely lose wars because they run out of soldiers or run out of courage. They lose the political will to keep paying an escalating price when the public no longer understands what the fight is actually for. That's not a prediction about Iran, specifically. That's just what tends to happen over and over whenever the gap between battlefield reality and the story being told back home grows too wide for too long to hold together. So hold both of these ideas in your head at the same time, because that's what real analysis actually requires. Yes, America remains an extraordinarily powerful nation in almost every measurable sense. And yes, the power is currently being stretched, strained, and quietly rationed in ways that rarely make it into a headline or a 30-second news clip. Both things are true at once. That tension right there is exactly why the president canceled those strikes instead of launching them. If you've made it this far into the video, you already understand more about this war than most people watching the nightly news tonight. But understanding the past is only half of the job we came here to do together. Let's talk about what happens next, because I want to lay out 3 specific predictions, clearly and on the record, and I want you to hold me accountable for every single one of them when we check back in. Quick pause here before we go further. If you've been nodding along, agreeing, maybe even feeling a little unsettled by some of these numbers we've just walked through, that reaction is exactly why this channel exists in the first place. Smash that like button right now if you want the follow-up video where we track whether these exact predictions actually come true over the coming months. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to see this kind of honest breakdown. Here's my first prediction, stated plainly. The negotiations announced for this week will not produce a lasting, durable agreement within the next 30 days. Iranian state media has given no real indication that Iran actually requested the strikes be called off in the first place. Iran's own foreign ministry has only confirmed that talks would continue. Not that any specific concrete terms have actually been agreed upon by both sides. We've seen this exact pattern play out before. Months ago, when strikes were postponed under very similar language about productive conversations, only for Iranian officials to immediately clarify afterward that no real negotiations had actually taken place at all. Iran appears to be playing for time, quietly stretching things out toward the election calendar back in America. The White House needs to look simultaneously strong and diplomatic at the same time. Those 2 competing goals simply cannot both be satisfied by the same fragile agreement, which strongly suggests that whatever gets signed in the short term is unlikely to hold for very long. Here's my second prediction. Within the next 90 days, expect the United States to begin deploying newer, more experimental missile defense technology, including laser-based interception systems, specifically to help stretch thin the remaining Patriot and THAAD batteries positioned across the Gulf region. The production numbers we've already walked through simply don't leave any other realistic option on the table. At current manufacturing speeds, against a stockpile that's already been reduced by more than half in some critical categories, the existing systems cannot realistically absorb another major escalation cycle without serious gaps in coverage. Officials will likely describe this shift publicly as forward-thinking modernization. In reality, underneath the press releases, it will be a forced adaptation, driven by the simple, uncomfortable fact that America is quietly running out of the specific weapons it needs to keep defending itself effectively in this conflict. Here's my third and final prediction. China will almost certainly never publicly confirm supplying weapons to Iran, no matter how much evidence eventually surfaces. But before this year ends, expect a second confirmed incident tied directly to Chinese-made military technology showing up somewhere in this war. Either another attack involving that same portable missile system we discussed, or solid evidence that the long-range, stealth-detecting radar has been actively used against America's most advanced aircraft. That evidence won't come from any official announcement out of Beijing. It will surface quietly through American military incident investigations, the same understated way the first incident did months ago. And when it does surface, it will create real, uncomfortable tension between the desire to use China as a diplomatic mediator in this conflict and the growing body of evidence suggesting China may be simultaneously arming the very side America is fighting against. Over the next few months, here are 3 specific things worth watching closely, because together they'll tell you far more about where this is heading than any single press conference ever will. Watch the Strait of Hormuz closely, and specifically watch which countries Iran allows to pass through and under exactly what conditions attached. Iran has recently started selectively allowing certain ships through. Based on separate bilateral deals, it's quietly negotiating entirely outside official American diplomatic channels. That evolving list of approved nations tells you far more about where this war is truly heading than any polished diplomatic statement ever could. Watch the price of oil just as closely. It dropped noticeably right after the ceasefire announcement first broke, settling somewhere down in the low 80s per barrel almost overnight. If these negotiations collapse the way I genuinely believe they will, expect that price drop to reverse itself fairly quickly. How fast that reversal actually happens will tell you whether the markets truly believe in this peace deal, or whether traders are simply reacting emotionally to a headline that lacks any real substance underneath it. Watch America's regional allies too, especially how closely Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states stick to Washington's script in the coming weeks. Coalitions built on shared urgency tend to hold together tightly while the danger feels immediate and the outcome feels uncertain. But the moment that urgency fades, even slightly, cracks tend to appear. Fast. Gulf nations sit far closer to Iranian missile range than the United States does, and their own populations are paying their own version of the price for this war every single day. If you start noticing softer, more cautious language coming out of Riyadh or Abu Dhabi in the coming weeks, that's not a minor detail buried in a wire report. That's a signal that the coalition itself may be quietly reconsidering how far it's willing to go if this conflict drags on much longer than anyone originally planned for. And finally, watch your own life closely, because this affects you directly whether you follow international news or not. Watch what you're personally paying at the gas pump each week. Watch how supply chains around you react to fresh disruptions. Watch how this distant war quietly shows up inside your own monthly household budget. Because that financial pressure isn't temporary or seasonal, it's structural, deeply built into the current situation, and it isn't going away just because one press conference happened to use the comforting word peace. There's an old idea from a respected philosopher of international relations that fits this exact moment with almost uncomfortable precision. He argued that a nation's reputation for overwhelming strength works best when that strength is so obvious to everyone that the nation never actually has to prove it through action. But when the real capability quietly sitting underneath that reputation begins to erode behind the scenes, leaders instinctively begin talking louder and more forcefully about their strength, precisely because that underlying strength is becoming less certain with each passing week. The words get bigger and bolder exactly when the reality underneath them gets shakier and more fragile. Think carefully about everything we've walked through together today, step by step. A stockpile of America's most critical defensive weapons cut by more than half in under 6 months of active fighting. A replacement timeline stretching years, not weeks, into the future with no realistic shortcut available. A single, low-cost, foreign-made missile that permanently changed how every single pilot in that region now calculates personal risk before every mission. A shadow fleet of aging tankers moving billions of dollars in sanctioned oil completely outside the reach of American financial power and enforcement. And a president who stood in front of the entire watching world announced the most aggressive bombing campaign of the entire war. And then, within 48 short hours, canceled the whole thing entirely without a real explanation that adds up. The loudest declarations of strength often arrive at the exact moment that strength is quietly being questioned behind closed doors, far from any camera or microphone. The most dangerous wars in history aren't always the ones with the biggest, most dramatic explosions on your screen. Sometimes they're the ones where the ammunition is quietly running low in silence, while the speeches keep getting louder and louder, almost as if trying to cover the sound of it running out. None of this means the outcome is already written. Wars this tangled rarely move in a straight line, and plenty of things could still shift the balance in ways nobody watching today can fully predict. A breakthrough in production could ease the interceptor shortage faster than expected. A genuine shift in Iranian leadership priorities could open a real path to a lasting deal instead of a temporary pause. Even China's quiet position could change if the economic math on its side ever stops favoring patience. Nothing here is set in stone, and that uncertainty is exactly why this story deserves careful tracking, instead of confident, one-sided predictions shouted from a headline. What we do know, with real confidence, is that the version of this war being explained in most quick news segments leaves out almost everything that actually determines how it ends. I'm going to keep tracking every single twist in this unfolding story, every broken promise, every quiet shipment crossing dark water, every number that simply doesn't add up, and the official version of events being handed to the public. If you want to be here in the room when the next piece of this puzzle finally reveals itself, make absolutely sure you're subscribed right now, because this story is moving fast, faster than most people realize, and I honestly don't think anyone watching the mainstream coverage is fully ready for where it goes next. Before you go, I genuinely want to hear directly from you on this one. Do you think these newly announced negotiations actually produce a real, lasting deal that holds past 30 days? Or do you think this entire war is being carefully paced and quietly timed around an election calendar back home, regardless of what happens on the actual battlefield? Type your honest answer down in the comments below right now. I read every single one of them personally, and honestly, your answers shape exactly what I choose to dig into for the very next video in this series.